Right. Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you here for our Discovery Series lecture. Today, we have with us a really distinguished linguist, but also a good friend who I have been meeting on various different occasions, and we're so happy that she came here today, Helen Aristar-Dry, and her presenting partner, who lives very close to us. That's right. A critic of all her work, Anthony Aristar-Dry. And as well, we have close by Gary Simons. Did I say it wrong? Anthony Aristar. You didn't take the dry name? No.
No. I'm a guy.
All right. Okay. All right. And we're also happy to have with us Gary Simons, who's come here from the Summer Institute of Linguistics. So we want to welcome everyone here who's physically here, as well as everyone who's joining us virtually on our YouTube channel. Andrea, they're able to post questions to you, and we will try to keep up with those and answer those as we go along. Is there a problem with the mic? Should I hold it farther back? Okay, I can hold it farther from my face and then try and see if that works. So we'd like to start with just a few seconds of introduction. That's more than what I've just said right now. So Haj Ross here, my colleague who knows a lot of people and knows a lot about a lot of people, would like to say some things with me.
I've got a lot of dirt on Helen. No, Helen and I know each other from sometime in Michigan, I think, a long time ago. Yeah. And I don't know much about her. I know that she wrote a terrific book with John Lawler, which I've always loved. It's called Using Computers in Linguistics. And it was one of the first books that I ever had in my hands, which had an electronic part. So it had pages, but it also had a place to go to. And it was written around 1980, is that right, or earlier?
Later, I think. Yes, 96, I think.
96. Well, I was only off by 15. That's
Every
bit
of it is now obsolete. That's the way the world works.
Yeah, that was, but it was
A long time
terrific.
ago.
Yeah. And of course, Linguist List is it right that it's the biggest list, the biggest electronic listserv, electronic bulletin, and it's the biggest one.
Biggest academic list, I think.
The biggest academic one. And anybody who's gone there is just overwhelmed by the richness of data, the kinds of data. It's just amazing. So we are really honored, as Shobana has said. And furthermore, this is a Texan. I didn't know that until just now. She is from, where are you from originally?
I was actually born in Dallas, not too
In
far
Dallas,
from here.
all the way from Dallas. Yeah. And a UT product who worked with Andy Rogers and Win Lehman?
Ruth Lehman, mostly for me, yes.
Yeah. So, okay, well, I'll pass on to the master of ceremonies.
Yeah. We'll learn a lot more about you as we go along today as well as tomorrow. Gary Simons is going to be giving one of our keynotes tomorrow and is going to be a discussant or throwing out comments throughout the talk today. So please go on our website and read more about their careers. They're on the COI website. So let's start. Thank you.
Well, this is my first time to be live streamed. So if I get tangled up in my wires here, you'll know that's the reason. I am going to talk on the EMELD project. And I'm very delighted to be here, I might add. The EMELD project was dear to my heart. In fact, it consumed my life for 7, maybe 8 years, between 2000, when we initiated the proposal, to 2007. I was invited here because I was told that there was some possibility that University of North Texas might want to revise or revive or repurpose parts of the project, and so they invited me here to describe the project and maybe reflect on what might still be potentially relevant. So I was preparing this talk around Halloween, and one of my friends said, this is very appropriate. You're talking about zombies risen from the grave. EMELD was a very big project. Its goals were to aid in the preservation of data and documentation on endangered languages, and to the development of infrastructure for linguistic archives. Okay, I don't even have to be facing the screen to get it out. Okay, good. EMELD stands for Electronic Metastructure for Endangered Languages Documentation. It was generously funded by the National Science Foundation. The participants, the lead institution was the Linguists list, which is a big website and email list and became an institute for academic linguists. At that time, it was at 3 universities. Now it's been consolidated at Indiana University. And some of the EMELD features are still available and some are not. Some did not make the transition. The Linguistic Data Consortium at the University of Pennsylvania was a collaborator, as was the Endangered Language Fund through Doug Whalen, who worked at Haskins Laboratory. And we were very fortunate throughout the project to have as our primary technical consultant Gary Simons of SIL International. So I'm going to talk about what is EMELD. But first, I thought that I really should give you some background on what the linguistic landscape was like in 2000 when we proposed the EMELD project. I don't know who's in my audience today, but I see a lot of people a lot younger than I am, so I think you are probably very familiar with things like the ideas of involved in digital archiving, and that was not the case in 2000 in linguistics. So then I'll move on to the project components. And if I have time, I want to bring up some associated projects, Multitree and LLMap, because I think they would be very nice zombies to revive as well. And then the second part of my talk is involved with what could be updated or repurposed. And to talk about that, we'll have to discuss, is there a need, what is being used now, and some possible advantages of EMELD. So what was the linguistic landscape like in 2001? I used to give talks entitled Endangered Languages and Endangered Data. But the situation within the linguistics community was quite different with regard to languages and data. With regard to languages, there was increasing awareness of the plight of endangered languages. There had been 12 institutes run by the American Indian Development Institute to train native speakers to document their languages. In 1991, Ken Hale organized a famous LSA Symposium on endangered languages, which was published in the lead journal of the discipline, Language, the next year in 1992. And that is the source of a quote that you hear constantly nowadays, that approximately half of the world's languages would be gone by the end of, he said, the next century, but that's our century. Did I do that? Okay, how melodious of me. But the situation was very different with regard to data, digital data, and the needs for standards and preservation. It's true that the main documentation project started a pilot project in 2000, and they did something very smart. They got the technical engineers at the Max Planck Institute at Nijmegen to develop the software for documentation collection and uploading and archiving. But in America, most of us didn't know anything about that unless you were a documentary linguist. Bird and Simons' 7 Dimensions of Portability of Language Documentation and Description, which is probably the seminal work on language digitization, was not published until 2003, though it did circulate in draft form before that. And the documentation of Endangered Languages program at NSF wasn't made a permanent program until 2007. And of course, we are privileged to have a former director thereof with us. So I think we can say that in linguistics, there was very little discussion of digital data. Now, I want to add this caveat that there was more awareness in other sciences. I found this great quote in Scientific American from 1995. It's only slightly facetious to say that digital information lasts forever, or 5 years, whichever comes first. Oh, sure. We have an audio problem, so let me ask who's in the audience here. How many of you are linguists? Okay, so you know about linguist lists, you know a good bit about language documentation and digitization, right? What else do we have? Well, library information scientists should know a lot more than I do about those topics, yes. Anthropologists? Oh, you're alone, Christina. Yeah.
Computational linguist.
Computational linguists, oh, that's great, yeah. Well, this is a wonderful audience. How many of you had heard of the EMELD project before? Some of the linguists had, okay. Are we good to go?
We're waiting for confirmation. All right.
Okay, let's see, can we resume the slideshow from wherever I was? Yes, good. Okay, we ended on a laugh. That's a good place to take up again. At least I was hoping for a laugh. Oops. I'm afraid the clicker isn't working anymore. There we go. Okay, the EMELD vision of digital language resources. This slide is also a look back in time. This is from a presentation Gary and I made in 2006 for the German Linguistic Society. You may recognize these words, Gary. I think they're basically yours. But it says in a nutshell what the EMELD vision of language resources was. Okay.
Should we use the arrow key and just go back to old-fashioned?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Could we just use the arrow key and go back to old-fashioned? Thank you.
Okay. Here we go. All right, digital language resources should be preservable, formats not vulnerable to physical decay or obsolescence of hardware and software. They should be intelligible. Content should be easily understood by future scholars. And one of the EMELD workshops, Doug Whalen said, we don't want to create another Rosetta Stone, and that sort of became our motto. They should be accessible. Distributed resources should be easily discovered and accessed. And they should be interoperable. In other words, documentation created by different scholars should be easily searched, compared, and reused. So here is the EMELD homepage. It's the project homepage. It's up on the University of Indiana site. And I might add, I'm using screenshots just for convenience. But anything with a blue background is reflects a live page in Indiana. Okay, so the main EMELD components were 4 workshops, the ontology gold, which I'll talk more about. The main part was the website, the School of Best Practices, and we created a number of online tools. So I'll talk about these in turn. the workshops, we had 7 workshops, which were focused on basically on different kinds of linguistic types. First one, the need for standards, and then digitizing lexical information, text and field recordings, databases, etc. Linguistic ontologies and data categories, that one was held at Harvard and was, we had our most eminent audience and our least successful result, and I'll tell you more about that later. 2006 was Tools and Standards, the State of the Art, and then interoperability. Now, here's a workshop homepage. They're all available. I just thought I would mention that because we have in the audience at least one of the people that helped organize these workshops, Dina Capitigiani. Are you still using your name? Yes. She was on the Linguist List team that organized some of these workshops, and they did a splendid job. There was a core group of invitees from all of the major projects that had anything to do with language digitization. And this turned out to be a very good thing to do, because for 7 years they could talk together, they could cross-fertilize their work, and it really, I think, had quite an effect on the digitization project as a whole. We also, though, had open call for abstracts, so there were new people every year. There was usually a pretty hefty advanced reading list. And then, of course, there were working groups with very specific tasks and leaders. And so the actual workshops had presentations, software demos, working group reports, both oral and written, and all the documents are available still on the email site. So the workshops really did result, I think, in a community of practice. And linguists and computer scientists in particular talked together. And we also had a number of native speakers and educators involved. And this resulted in consensus on the major points, the major needs for preservation and long-term intelligibility, tool and archive interoperability, and resource discovery and accessibility. So specific EMELD recommendations came out of the workshops. And these included, for preservation of the data, we were recommending digitizing. In 2000, everybody's, well, almost every documentary linguist had their documentation on audio cassettes. You know, a lot of people had, well, I'll tell you, one of our sets of data was a shoebox. It was the typical thing, a shoebox that had been, you know, moldering 20 years in, 20 years in somebody's closet. This was the kind of thing that was happening to note cards and paper annotation and audio cassettes. And then we also recommended deposition in a digital archive. And what was new about EMELD was insisting that an archive wasn't just a website. Everybody was putting their data up on a website and saying they had an archive. But as Gary Simons always used to point out, an archive is a permanent repository with institutional support and a data migration plan to cope with technological changes. For intelligibility of the data, we had to start with characters. Nobody knew what Unicode was. Nobody was using Unicode. So we actually we built a little keyboard where you could input Unicode characters, and we had to try to convince people that this was the way to go. And in terms of intelligibility of annotation, this was where GOL, the General Ontology for Linguistic Description, came in. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we wanted annotation mapped to an interlanguage, what today we're calling harmonization of markup. As for accessibility of the data, Well, we needed a descriptive metadata standard. At the first workshop, I mean, nobody even knew the word metadata, and Bob Blust almost walked out. I don't know if he said, "This is boring, and why doesn't the librarian do it?" Excuse me, librarians. But all he wanted to do was talk at his data. So anyway, we needed descriptive metadata for linguistics. It was different from the standards current in information science then. And needed metadata harvesting, search, and retrieval. So we were very fortunate to be able to collaborate with the OLAC project. That stands for Open Language Archives Community. Gary and Stephen Bird were developing the OLAC site at University of Pennsylvania, and there was a great deal of cross-fertilization of the projects. One of the tools we built for EMELD was a OLAC repository editor. At that time, we thought that the individual linguist would write metadata, descriptive metadata of his collection, put it into the HTML, the XML that would be harvested by HTTP protocols and make it accessible to the OLAC server. So we wrote a tool that was designed to help them do that. And so, in sum, EMELD needed to develop standards and to promulgate these among the members of the linguistic community. So that was what came out of the workshop. So let's move on to GOLD, which stands for General Ontology for Linguistic Description. And this is another resurrected zombie slide. This one is from 2003. A talk in which I was trying to explain that the objective was a system which allows field workers to submit data in different markups and the searcher to retrieve all relevant data despite varying markups. And then we thought this was a very funny joke, yuck, yuck, that it was not a gold standard that we were aiming for in linguistic markup, but rather an ontology of concepts intended to serve as an inner language for translation among markups. Now, we had many workshops in which we talked about GOLD, and we collaborated with the Surrey Morphology Group for 2 years. We had an LSA workshop, but we could not, this was, the first workshop was the 2005 Harvard EMELD workshop that I mentioned to you, where we almost had to break up fights. The linguistic community just would not agree on concepts or categories, nor, I think, did we do a very good job of explaining that we weren't trying to come to the perfect set of data categories, that we were talking about something that would lie behind data categories. So, as a result, in 2008, a sort of core set of data categories that they called Core Gold, it was kind of flattened from being an ontology into just a set of data categories, and was integrated into the ISOCAT registry. This was the International Standards Organization registry of data categories, which represented an attempt to arrive at, they were doing what we were not trying to do, to get a standard set of data categories. So I am not exactly, well, I'm not pleased, but I'm not surprised that they also failed. The original mandate to standardize data categories was never fulfilled. And eventually ISOCAT became DataCat Info, and it ceased to be an ISO project. But the general ontology for linguistic description still exists. It went through many, many iterations. It was scrutinized by the best linguists in the world. It's up still on the Indiana site. In various versions, there's a nice HTML gold viewer. There's a version in XML that you can download. There's a version in the ontology working language. So it could still be picked up if, as Gary was saying on the way over, somebody would invite the killer app that used it, because an enormous amount of work went into it. here is the interface to the HTML version. If you click on any of these links, you will find a definition of this concept and several examples drawn from the literature. And there's an enormous amount of work that's gone into this. So this is one zombie I'd like to see live again. Online tools I'm not going to say much about because they are not still available. But I just have this OLAC slide to show that OLAC is in fact thriving, even though the OLAC repository editor is gone. So now we come to the School of Best Practices, which was the heart of the EMELD project, really. And we took the metaphor of a school, perhaps too seriously. So we had rooms. The entrance hall introduced why best practices and had different entry points for different users. That is for linguists, for archivists, for speaker community members. The tool room was a database of links and reviews of hardware and software tools. The reading room was a searchable database, which has 413 bibliography items in it. Then we could probably double that number today. The workroom was where you had access to the tools we created. We had tools to create a lexicon, to map terminology to Go, to create metadata, to write Unicode, and so forth. There was the Ask an Expert room where you could submit questions to a panel of experts. And the classroom was the major feature of the school, of course, where we had specific recommendations on collecting, digitizing, and preserving documentation. And we also had case studies, which were step-by-step examples of successful language documentation efforts. So let's look at the school, and I'll flip through these slides pretty quickly. They're very text-heavy. We really did need a user experience consultant. But there's a lot of information in them. This is the welcome page, the entrance. And there you see the entry path for archivists. And if you click on it, you find things like path through the school and topics like how does language data differ from other primary resources and things like that. The reading room I've already mentioned. We had some 413 bibliography items. The tool room was kind of interesting to me because this is only one page of it. These are links to tools with user reviews. But there were 5 pages of tools. And it's interesting because it's very different from today. At that time, every project was writing its own tools. Yeah, and virtually all of these are no longer supported, which, even though we were involved in writing some of them, I think is a good thing because it aids in interoperability. Today, most field linguists use probably 1 of 4 or 5 tools, most of which were created by SIL International. The classroom was organized so that you could have multiple entry points. So we organized by media types, by documentation types, that is lexicons, interlinear gloss text, by the assorted technologies like Unicode and XML and style sheets, XML style sheets, and then preservation issues like working with an archive and archive ethics. And so if we were to look at the text pages, you would see stuff on character encoding and writing XML, and I was just showing you there that all of the pages had these interactive menus to the side so that you could find anything from any page. So let's look at the case studies. The case studies were 11 languages, documentation of 11 languages, which you see here, which came to us in different formats and which we digitized according to best practices. Two were audio cassettes. Potawatomi was in FileMaker Pro. Sisala and Mokavi were in Shoebox. And Biao Min was kind of interesting. This was the set of note cards that had been in David Solnit's closet for 10 or 20 years. But it was at that time, and it may still be, the only documentation that we knew of on this language. So it was very important for us to digitize these and make them available. So for each one of these languages, we had a section about the language and then also a section about the data. And when we talked about the data, we talked about the original format and why it was unlikely to last. And then we went through the digitization path of the data. So for Biao Min, here are some pages on about the language. The map and the family tree there that you see became interactive when we had the multi-tree and LM map projects. So, and then there was just information on the vowel and consonant and tone register and so on. Here's a schematic of the Biao Min digitization path. We took the note cards and then we scanned them into an archival format, which was TIFFs. And so there were pages that you were able to access from that at that point on archival versus presentation format. We made lots of tests of scan settings because one of the things that we had to push was that linguists should use a scanner that was capable of at least 600 DPI. And so then we went on to creating a lexicon from the Biao Min note cards. And the school talked about OCR versus keyboarding, introduced XML. We had a tutorial on XML. We explained that you could use XML style sheets, which was the technology at the time, to give various presentation formats from XML. And then we moved on to creating an archive-ready collection. So there was a section on creating image metadata, finding an archive, working with an archive from the first, and so on. I will show you a few of these pages, but they all look the same. Whoops. Well, here's what the note cards look like. Here's the page in which we talked about digitization, quality issues, compression, color depth. And one thing I should mention is that each bit of possibly unfamiliar terminology was linked to an extensive glossary. And then, as I said, we had lots of information on scanning settings. Here you see scans at 500 DPI, but various contrast and color and so on. And we had the same kinds of examples with 300, 400, etc. I'm just showing you all of this stuff to show that there was quite a lot of depth to these lessons, quite a lot of detail. And then we talked about presentation format for digitized images, OCR versus keyboard. And then we were trying to teach people to write XML. One of my friends threw up her hands and said, "I can't even spell XML." And then we had a nice little thing showing the various presentation formats you could get through style sheets from the same XML form of file. And then we went on to creating an archive-ready corpus. So in sum, I think I can say that the features of the school were that we had pretty broad and deep coverage of the relevant issues, that there were multiple entry points, not only for each category of users, but for each kind of text type and so on, media types, as well as entry through the case studies, extensive cross-referencing, terminology linked to a large glossary, numerous examples of almost everything, and links to associated online tools, now unavailable and undoubtedly unnecessary. And the instructions were extensively edited by our group of wonderful linguist list graduate students. So that was emailed. Should it be revived? Workshops, well, it's interesting. I do think they were very successful because the working groups had specific tasks of obvious usefulness and a community was built. But that format is frequently replicated in current projects. Jeff Good mentioned to me about a year ago, I think, that EMELD was the first project in linguistics to use working groups. And so I was kind of proud about that, pleased, because they worked very, very well. I was going on the theory that people would always rather talk together than listen to a presenter. So, yeah. Sorry, no working groups today. Now, the ontology. Well, despite many explanations that Gold was a set of concepts, not terms, and designed to work as an interlanguage between different annotation schemes, we really couldn't get linguists to agree on the concepts. So the lesson, I think, linguists naturally are very invested in their analytical categories. And splitters will not become lumpers just because technologists preach interoperability. So I do think harmonization is still the way to go. And I'm pleased that the ideas become the mainstream now. But I think that it will work if the software does it behind the scenes. The lesson of EMELD is don't ask the linguists themselves to harmonize the data categories. But I think Gold still has a role to play. It was intended to contribute to knowledge engineering, not to be a set of data categories, and it still could be useful for that purpose. Here's a quote from Scott Farrar and Terry Langengoen, who were the primary developers. And they said they developed it through EMELD, but such an ontology, however, is needed outside of the EMELD project for enhancing performance of the semantic web, for developing expert systems capable of linguistic analysis, and for providing a theory-neutral background in the processing of scientific documents pertaining to the linguistic domain. Gold encapsulates an enormous amount of specialist linguistic knowledge that I think knowledge engineers could make use of in the right circumstances. Online tools, no. I think it's good that projects are not any longer trying to develop a homegrown set of tools. We all know that good tools require extensive testing. And well-written user manuals. Of course, linguists write very well, but they handle details well. They don't simplify well. And user manuals, I can say this, I'm retired now. But user manuals, I think, should be professionally written. And of course, you need an institutional commitment for bug fixes and upgrades and so on. So my motto is let SIL do it. They've done a splendid job for years and years. And they do all of those things. Now, the School of Best Practices. Well, this was a hard question to me. Should something like this be revived? It was kind of like going through a trunk in the attic, you know, where everything you pull out is precious to you. But the question, you know, would anybody else be interested in your confirmation certificate? You know, you just don't know. So I came up with a qualified yes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about feasibility and is there a need? So let me just point out one major trend that probably everyone here is aware of. Trend since 2001. Okay, I think our goals remain the same: preservation, accessibility, intelligibility, and so on. But more and more, we ask less and less of the linguist and more of the software. And I do think this is the way to go. Because to be a specialist in a language is a gigantic task. To ask them to master what is essentially another realm of knowledge was just not really the way to go. But there wasn't much choice in 2000. The tools weren't there. But now, of course, for character encoding, Unicode is written by browsers and word processors, and so linguists don't have to worry about that. As I've mentioned, fewer tools in common use makes interoperability easier to attain. XML, all the tools write it behind the scenes. The linguist doesn't need to bother with it. Metadata harvesting, the linguist still needs to write descriptive metadata about their documentation. But the harvesting and the presentation really has become the province of the archive. We are no longer thinking in terms of individual repositories of language documentation. So the school today could teach fewer topics. The hardest thing to update in the school would be the technology, but much of it doesn't need updating. And there is a great deal more that has nothing to do with technology. When I say that much of it doesn't need updating, I mean it could just be abandoned. It's not necessary anymore. You could teach fewer topics: database design, creating and maintaining descriptive metadata during the course of your field project, working with an archive from start to finish, and even, as I'll point out when we get to my talk about LLMAP, registration of suitable things during your language documentation. That's fairly easy to teach with modern technology. So I looked around the web trying to see what the situation is today. Well, there aren't any similar websites. There used to be a lot of them. They've all been discontinued, abandoned, not maintained. Of course, there's good reason for that. You need a very committed curator and an institutional commitment. So this really cuts two ways. Do we need another EMELD, which might not be maintained? But nothing is, no websites out there doing the same thing anymore. SIL has a wonderful website, I might say, but it doesn't attempt, as far as I can tell, the same kinds of things. Under training there, you get an introduction to training programs for specialists. Same things with ELAR. Now, there have been a lot of excellent books published since EMELD on endangered languages and language documentation. Celia and Derusa there show up twice. Should we update the school? Well, it's true there are many more information sources since EMELD. Books and journals. There are courses in documentary linguistics at universities, institutes like COLANG, and websites are difficult to keep current. So these are pretty heavy qualifications. I would like to say, though, that EMELD did have some advantages. It was a one-stop shop. Not only did it take documentation from collecting through archiving, but the point of view was consistent and coherent throughout, which you don't get when you send people off to various other sites and books. The books can't be as concrete and specific as we were because they would get outdated and publishers wouldn't go for that. And courses and institutes are not as consistently accessible. So there are arguments both ways. Maybe a limited kind of school that had fed directly into what you wanted people to, how people should interact with your archive. what an archive-ready corpus was to Corsel say, and how to create it, and so on, might be possible. But I would also like to mention, and I'll try to be brief, some things, some other zombies that I think could be revived, and I think should be revived, really. Well, for one thing, the lexical data from the case studies, and then the bibliography and family tree data from multi-tree, and the map information from LLMap. So LLMap and multi-tree were associated projects. They weren't EMELD per se, but they were integrated with the case studies. And I think they're important. And here again, I'm quoting Gary Simons, as I often do. But he said on the way over here, you know, we could put the lexical data from the case studies into an archive, but the information in multi-tree and LLMap can still be added to and expanded, and should be. It's like gold. Enormous amount of work was done on it. An excellent start was made. But in the transition to Indiana, even though they did a splendid job of translating it to various new technologies, I think they would agree that the website lost something. And so I'll just show you a little bit of that. First, the lexical data from EMELD. It's hardly big data, but we have 22,726 lexical items in a P-SQL database, so it would be very easy to migrate them into some kind of form. And what I've got there, what that chart shows, like for Biao-Mien, there are only 1,664 lexical items from Biao-Mien, but the linguist also had comparative form from related languages, Lu-Mien, Kim-Mien, and Mandarin. So that's what this chart is showing. And I don't have all the languages there, but it shows you that for many languages, there are not many forms. EGA, just 512. But I don't know how much data exists on some of these languages, but probably not much. Okay, let me turn to multi-tree and LLMap. Multi-tree was another NSF-sponsored project, and it had a very dynamic star tree interface, which was a lot of fun to play with, showing family trees, hypotheses about family trees for languages. Once again, we were not trying, just like with gold, we were not trying to decide what the family tree was. It was like a library of hypotheses that people had proposed about family trees. And I don't know exactly how many we have, but we went through 1,058 unique bibliography entries and entered probably most of those entries proposed a tree or a part of a tree, and we put it in the database. And LLMap was another NSF-sponsored project, and the crew of the Linguist List digitized 1,020 language maps, a lot of them from printed sources that are now out of print, like the 1929 survey of India by the British Survey of India. So let's see, this is a quote from Damir Chavar, who now runs the Linguist List. He told me that the new front end was developed using the newest OpenGIS, Django, and Python 3, Postgres, SQL, and so on, JavaScript, and mapping libraries. The main point of that is it's all open source. So let me just show you a little bit. This is how you search in the new multi-tree. And of course, the interface is interactive. You find a region such as Africa, and then up pops a list of language families that have members in Africa. So you might choose Afroasiatic. And then if you chose Afroasiatic, up would pop whole list of trees of Afroasiatic taken from those bibliographical sources. And so this much of the new interface, I think, is an improvement on the old multi-tree. But unfortunately, the tree viewer, I think, is just not as handy. So here is a screenshot of the old viewer that we had, rather than the new one, which for various reasons I just decided not to show. But anyway, we have all that bibliographical information and all of the trees in a format that can be shown graphically. In terms of LLMap, over 1,000 language maps. This is the new site, and this is just a list of the language maps. Suppose you wanted to look at the Greek dialects. Here's a screenshot from the new interface. And here's the front page of the Greek dialects map. And we still have also, for each one of the maps, this is a screenshot of a digitized map, but for each one of the maps that we digitized, we also scanned the original map, and they're available too. So this is a lot of valuable data, I think. And also one thing that the old site had was quite tight integration of all the linguist list resources with the maps, so that you could, if you had a map of, say, the Greek dialects, you had tabs below where you could get to OLAC resources on whatever language you were looking at. The ethnologue, the multi-tree, you could see a list of the hypotheses about language relationships and click to that. It was also integrated with the linguist list site. You could bring up all the books on that language, all the people that were working on the language, and so on. And this is really not directly relevant to EMELD, but since we're talking about things that I think could be really usefully revived, I just wanted to point out that multi-tree and LLMap, even though they exist, I think that the current linguist crew would agree that the websites could be enhanced, and that the tight integration that we once had was a very desirable thing, and would be something that we might want to think about if another grant were proposed. So I'm going to undercut everything I've said, well, because Doug Whalen sent me this wonderful cartoon. Look at this. My access to resources on X subject over time. Book on the subject goes on forever. But look, the web database, the site goes down, the back-end data is not on the archive. Skipping down to interactive CD-ROM, the CD gets scratched, new computer has no CD drive anyway, et cetera, et cetera. So we're still facing technical obsolescence. But the best thing about this cartoon was the mouse over. I spent a long time thinking about how to design a system for long-term organization and storage of subject-specific informational resources. Isn't it great? Without needing ongoing work from the experts who created them, only to realize I just reinvented libraries. So thank you very much. That's what I had to say today.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. We could start with questions, but why don't we take one or two questions, and while we're answering those, we can have some of our library science colleagues who graciously agreed to come here and see how they might, ask more questions about this resource, and how, their professions might integrate with them. So I'll ask you to come up, and while you're coming up, and we'll get some chairs out for you.
Do you all have some general questions that you'd like to ask? Anything?
Oh, I don't know.
Don't mind what we're forward sitting up.
Well, I'd like to ask Dina, was it fun to work on EMELD?
It was a very good experience. I must say.
It was difficult, wasn't it? Yes.
At the beginning it was because we were throwing there without having any training at all, right? It was
Right.
easy to
Yes, same for
figure out,
me.
you know, like coding and writing forms and finding bugs and fixing everything. But it was an experience that it will stay, you know, forever with us. Some of us actually went on to become computational linguists, right?
Oh, yes, yes, several people. And one went on to become a digital archivist at Indiana. Yeah, it was sort of sink or swim, but the ones that swam quite a distance. Yeah.
It was true, we had someone come in whom we had been told that we work on the computer. And we put it down the computer and said, here's the one, and they answer this, and your computer, this is what we're going to do. She just white space of it. This girl is now a computational linguist.
Oh, working for Google, she's quite a whiz, yeah.
So one of the questions that I had that I'd like to bring Oksana and in is the question of our students and student participation in putting this whole huge project together. But before I start that, let me just ask our two colleagues to introduce themselves. Oksana, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Oksana Zavalina, a faculty in the Information Science Department. My area is metadata. Interoperability is one of the aspects of what I am doing. I teach metadata courses, which I think we could integrate some of the related projects into these courses to get some help for the students.
Oh, that would be wonderful, yeah.
And that was
My name is Annie Kim. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Information Science, UNT. I teach data libraries, data creation, basically teach how to preserve the archive data.
Wonderful.
right, exactly. So, would you like to go ahead and do you have any comments, or I can?
Some comments and maybe also questions. I really like this collaboration that we presented with OLAC and how we all play together nicely with the descriptive metadata. I had questions which I don't know if you can address about OLAC metadata scheme. What is the current stage of it? I've seen on the website like OLAC proposal as of 2001, which was based on Dublin-4 codified, which looks a really good metadata scheme that just, if it hasn't been updated recently, might need some tweaking to be more semantic fact ready with all the XML schema being published and the Wikidata version of like Dublin-4 Metadata Initiative now has DCMI terms,
Right.
what served as a basis for OLAC.
Right.
So presenting the documentation for OLAC's metadata scheme in this way, and posting the metadata elements that the open metadata registry, which would make it immediately linked data accessible, and then going from there. So that would also be a great project for our students, to help contribute to this.
Oh, it would indeed, yes, and it would be exciting to have them doing that. I think Gary is the one really to answer the question about OLAC, but I know we dealt with DCI terms, so it was updated to a certain point past 2001.
Oh, definitely.
No.
Should I get a
Yeah, the 2001 was the initial,
Right.
the
I don't know
first
when-
call to play. And then after we had people participate, then we got together and worked on really developing what now is the standard. And the dates on that is in the order of 2006, 7, 8, or when the revisions of all the standards came out. We had wasn't an email grant, but another grant member and I had worked on that. So if you go to the site, you'll see dates in the latter part of the decade, the last decade. It hasn't really changed since then because it's just, it works. However, we have been following the linked data movement, watching at a distance, wishing that we could start playing that game. But unfortunately, we as OLAC, so Stephen Bird and I, organize it, but there's 60 institutions that have to do all the work. They have to do something to their catalog to make it work with a central infrastructure that we have. So we started that discussion actually last year, I think it was. We had a workshop in Austin with the Delamon group, the digital.
Yes.
They're still in existence.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. And actually presented ideas that Stephen and I have had about expressing OLAC as linked data. In fact, I've got a paper coming out in the book that Barbara Lust has edited from a workshop that we had a couple of years ago on linked data and linguistics. So we've got a proposal out there of what it would look like, but we actually, Stephen and I both feel like it needs to end up in the library community, not in the linguistics community, if it's really going to fly and survive. So we need partners in the library community who want to start taking the lead on how do we put our metadata into that kind of framework.
Have you been working? Okay, so I was just wondering if you've been in contact with the DCMI, the Link Format Data Initiative, like Stuart said, and others. They could be good collaborators for making OLAC as an official standard metadata application profile, whatever you call it, the version of the Link form, which would attract more attention from librarians, information scientists who are mainly participating in the DCMI community, and more feedback and help from them as well.
To some extent. No, it's okay now. So, we had, well, the presentations that one can find online, at least at my website, the things we did last year to talk to the Delamon group. It does talk about application profile and proposes what one would look like. So we've been following that and realized that's the next step if we really want to do that. We've also had discussions with one of the principals. Is Mark Baker the name of somebody?
Thomas Baker, I think.
Tom Baker.
Tom Baker.
I think that's the guy. We've actually talked to him, but that was almost 10 years ago now. And he was very encouraging. But like I said, we've got 60 institutions that all have to actually do the work to make it happen. So we haven't had another grant or something like that to harness that kind of energy and get all those people together to agree to stuff to it. But I do agree that the application profile that's where it needs to go to take on.
Thank you. I have one more question. Please forgive my ignorance because I'm very new to metadata describing, representing linguistic data, and especially the linguistic analysis data. I was trying to read the paper from 2007 called what's the name? Okay. This is the one that you recommended actually. It's a Gold Community of Practice.
Yes.
So I kept noticing in my reading of this article that the issue, and you also addressed it today, that there is no agreement among linguists on the concepts, and the same terms might be used in different sub-communities to refer to different concepts, or the same concept might be represented by different sub-communities of linguists with different terms. So that's what the mapping, I read something about the mapping that was developed to map these terms. Am I interpreting this right?
Yes, that was the idea. Yeah, I don't think we ever actually got that far. Yes, each sub-community, well, to take Susan Kuhn's example, whether you call something past or perfective or completed or completive or whatever, you may have come to that use of that term from analyzing a certain set of data, which will have these detailed features. Oops. Oh, I actually have a mic on. Is it not working?
No, it's just, there's a lot of,
Okay. I thought what was needed was to sort of step back and see, okay, each sub-community that used one of those terms, if you had looked at it in detail, as they all did if they were sitting around the table, and then the details were in conflict. I'm being a little facetious, but these were, people that I respect enormously, and I could never do what they do. But I would often just wish that somebody could step back a little bit further and say, what do all these terms have in common? Forget the differences. And that's what I would like to say. Okay, we'll call this the concept, and we'll deal with the differences when you're handling a specific set of data. Because I wanted people to keep the goal in mind, which was search and retrieval. Yeah. So it didn't matter if you maybe found a few things which weren't exactly what you meant by completed. It was more important that you find everything that could go in that bag. Yeah.
anybody want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I share that wish, right? And I think there's an analog right now in the computational linguistics community with the universal class tag set, universal dependencies, and so on. So yeah. I hope maybe we can use the success of that effort as a bit of motivation for why one might want to do this. Really emphasizing the fact that we're not talking about replacing the original analysis. We're talking about mapping into a coarser grained set, most likely, that will allow us to do this sort of comparison.
Yes, thanks, Alexis. Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. And I think indeed today we'd have a much easier time putting that point across, because there are so many applications that show the utility of doing just that. We didn't have those in 2000. Yeah.
I think also at that time it was very difficult to get across to people that in an ontological framework you could fairly easily incorporate subtle differences, even though you do have basic categories which are fairly coarse. But we never managed to get that across.
Nevertheless, the work that went into gold and the good work that went into gold was enormous. And I don't know any other thing that encapsulates so much knowledge of potential linguistic data categories. So I would like to see that work used in some way.
I'm scared to turn this on.
What if I just talk loudly? Will they hear me?
We can do it.
Hold
Turn
it
it on
closer to
again.
your mouth, not up like this.
Hold it closer to your mouth like this, okay, and talk softer. No, like this, right here. So it seems like we've covered two vastly different topics that are both so important, and that would it be possible to take EMELD and say, at one point we had one resource for these things, but we could split it off so that one institution would be working on gold and we'd have a different institution working on metadata. There's no reason to now think of it all as having to be together. although it started off as such.
Yes, you're quite right. That's a good point. Yeah. Even in the genesis of the project, we had, the gold was basically the baby of the University of Arizona team. Yeah, so we had some of that from the start.
I just had one other, well, I've got so many different thoughts, but I'll just share one more, and I think Christina Watson might want to add on something to this, and that is, EMELD initially was for the professional linguist, but now more and more we see community members being linguists themselves, and so the purpose and the audience for EMELD has also changed, and so we should probably be thinking in, for metadata, for example, people have been talking about the complexities of metadata for community members who want to upload their material. So there's a whole nother reason why a school would be of importance, even though it may not be important in the way that you were saying, should we bring it back or not? There's probably a population that needs it.
That's a very good point.
Okay.
Introduce yourself first, maybe.
Okay, I'm Christina Watson, and I'm a linguistic anthropologist, but also a design anthropologist. And my interest in language archives is in improving the user experience and sort of their usability for the whole range of different user groups. And it seems to me that the linguists are kind of at the table already, and so maybe the user groups that could benefit the most from additional attention are the language communities. And Shobana really said most of what, sort of summarized, I think, what the issues are really nicely. It is true that when I was looking at the EMELD website while you were talking to kind of like explore that, and I think everything that's up there is excellent, but it's true that there's a lot it doesn't really talk about. That's the stuff I'm interested in, which is how to work with multiple user groups, communities, and do, of course, my bias is do some ethnographic research with these user groups, do sort of participatory, collaborative kind of research to identify what are the important things to them that should be incorporated in a language archive that would be, most useful to them, including even things like technology limitations. So sometimes there's such limited access to the internet and to computers that, for instance, building in a capability to easily print documents and circulate, paper copies of things.
Yes, that's a very
good
useful. Yes, yes, you're exactly right that if there is an audience for an EMELD-like site now, I think it is communities and native speaker linguists and educators within the community that want to do something, build a community archive, for example. Yeah. We really needed a user experience consultant. The EMELD pages are so text heavy. They look like linguistic textbooks, which I guess was okay for the linguist audience that we were serving. Well, not for the communities.
Something to remember is that at that time we were finding an incredible uphill battle because we had no one who really knew much about this. Something like, for example, Unicode was a magic word that people might use, but they had not a clue what it was. And so what we were trying to do was to get the linguistic community to actually start using some of the stuff and do it in a way that was consistent and always interoperable. And so that was really the battle we were facing then. Now we wouldn't have to fight that battle anymore. So something like you want would be very feasible, I think, now.
And exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Annie here, because at one point we did have some of our students, I think 2 of our students, taking classes with you for your digital curation classes. It seems like it's a kind of proficiency that all of our students should have. And so I'm wondering if you had thought about that at all, about
the ways in which we could bring our curriculum together and have a project of this sort be part of our class work. And is that how your students, for example, so I'll ask you first, and then maybe after we hear Helen's answer, we can think about UNT and how UNT might integrate our curricula to deal with this. Did you have students in Michigan who were working on these things, and was it part of their?
It was part of their linguist list jobs. The linguist list became an institute that was at Eastern Michigan, and so we had GAs, and to a great extent we had our own funding and fund drives and so on. So the students, it was the email site was all put together by students. But it was not done as a part of classwork. Now, we collaborated with some technical writing classes for some of we had a manual, a linguistless manual, and they basically wrote that. But mostly, it was all student work, but it was done in teams as part of their linguistless GA-ship work, their research work.
I am actually.
Because it's on. It's safe.
I am serving as Director of Data Creation and Data Management Graduate Academic Certificate, which is actually an outcome of IMLS funded project. IMLS is Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is one of our major funding sources in library information science. This project was initially proposed to build capacity in curriculum for data creation and data management competency. Our project was not the first data creation capacity building project, but unlike other similar projects, we targeted not only NRA students and professionals, but also graduate students from other disciplines. Those graduate students, master's and PhD students from engineering, sciences, humanities, who are actually interested in learning about, how to preserve their own data set, or may be responsible for managing data for their research project. Right? And the decision we made on our target group actually was driven by a couple of rationales. One is this, data creation, preservation of research data include a variety of activities, including gathering data, describing, organizing data so that it can be identified and discovered, placing data in context of related information, supporting data use for intellectual purposes, and ensuring its long-term survival and preservation, right? And all these data creation activities form some kind of research practice, part of research practices in many disciplines.
Yes.
So, disciplinary scholars need sufficient skills and knowledge, right, to perform some kind of data creation with their data set, right? So that has many implications for the design of our curriculum. And so that's why we ended up developing a series of courses to educate our students and students from other disciplines. And I believe another rationale is that the skills and knowledge to perform data creation actually are highly dynamic and interdisciplinary. It's not just technical skills.
Right.
These knowledge and skills include kind of integrated understanding of librarianship, computing, information technology, archival practice, and domains and disciplines generating using data, right? So that rationale actually by inviting students from other disciplines, we hope to create some kind of dynamic interdisciplinary learning environment. So where our students and students from other disciplines can share, exchange ideas, perspectives, and experiences. And I think all the examples you presented today, they actually serve as a good learning examples students can utilize, right, and practice. And
that sounds like an exciting project. Yeah. Do you have different courses for the different subdisciplines, or is it a single curriculum?
So this graduate academic certificate is comprised of 4 courses. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic thing to be doing. And I don't know that many schools that are doing it. I mean, but I think it's a wonderful thing. When I was dealing with EMELD, I remember there was, I would get invited to talk about this to anthropologists, to humanities, English people, it's perfectly true that these same issues come up in discipline after discipline. Yeah.
Open it up to the floor again. If anybody else had any issues, were you thinking about anything to do with recorded sociolinguistic speech, or our librarian folks in the back, anything for today? All right. Okay, well, I want to make sure that I mention that tomorrow morning we're going to be back here, and we're going to be here most of the day. We're going to be talking about very much the same issues, but dealing specifically with creating a resource for South Asian languages. And I hope that all of our students who are here will return, not only the ones who are volunteering to help, but also the ones who you're gonna listen and see, because it will be so exciting to have these activities going on here, because you would be an integral part of making those things happen. Wonderful. Absolutely. So Helen, we have a lot more to talk about, but I think we're going to let people get to their dinners, and thank you for coming out, and hope to see you here tomorrow. What time tomorrow? We're starting the talk. When is the first talk? We're starting at 8:45, and we have opening remarks at 9:30. All right. Thank you.